Have you ever wondered what happens to a hamburger once you eat it? Well, you're going to find out in this video as we explore the structure and function of the digestive system. Let's start with the function. Aside from the fact that it tastes good, why would you eat a hamburger? Well, the hamburger is made up of nutrients that our cells need. Nutrients like carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. But in a hamburger form, they're too big to get into cells. So the job of the digestive system is to break down these large materials into materials that are small enough to enter cells. In other words, monomers like sugars, fatty acids, and amino acids. Now, this process happens in a few different stages. One stage is mechanical digestion. This is just the process of breaking food down physically into smaller pieces. That's followed by chemical digestion. During chemical digestion, the food is already quite small, but what happens is that the polymers are chemically broken down into their monomers. For example, protein is broken down into amino acids, and let's say the starch in the hamburger bun is broken down into sugar molecules, and maybe the fat in the cheese and the grease is broken down into fatty acids. And this process is catalyzed by enzymes, because if you remember, all chemical reactions need enzymes to get them going. Another important thing that happens in your digestive system is absorption. This is when the nutrient monomers, now that they're nice and tiny, are actually absorbed into your cells. So to see how these three processes occur, let's take a look at the structure of the digestive system. So we're going to start at the beginning. This gentleman is eating an apple, but we can easily pretend that he's eating a hamburger as well. It's first going to enter the mouth. That's pretty basic. From there, it goes into the oral cavity. So the oral cavity is the space within your mouth. From there, it goes into the pharynx or throat. From there, it passes into the esophagus, a nice long tube, and then into the stomach. After the stomach, it goes into the small intestine, which is actually rather long, and from the small intestine, it goes into the large intestine, which oddly is not as long as the small intestine. And then from there, it's stored in the rectum and passes out through the anus. Now let's take a closer look at what happens to food in each of these organs. And as we take a look, we're going to see that there are a few other glands that help the process occur. The salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Now, these are considered accessory organs because food doesn't enter these four organs, but these organs do make digestive juices that help the other main organs do their job. So, starting with the oral cavity, two key things happen in the oral cavity. One is mechanical digestion. The teeth breaks food down into smaller pieces. However, the salivary glands will secrete amylase in saliva, and that chemically breaks down starch into sugar molecules. So the hydrolysis is catalyzed by the amylase in saliva. From there, the food is going to pass into the pharynx. Not much exciting happens in the pharynx, but at this point, the food has to be swallowed. And the epiglottis is an important structure that comes into play here. When food is swallowed, there are two paths it could take. It could enter the trachea, or windpipe, which would be very, very bad because that's part of the respiratory system, or it could enter the esophagus, which is good because the esophagus is the food tube. So what happens when you swallow is that the swallowing forces this little flap, the epiglottis, to cover the trachea so that food naturally goes down into the esophagus. And then once the food is swallowed, the epiglottis moves back up so that you can breathe again through your trachea. Now that the food is in the esophagus, the food is going to get moved down into the stomach. And this occurs because the esophagus is basically a big muscular tube that squeezes the food down. And there's a special word for this squeezing. It's called peristalsis. Once the food enters the stomach, some exciting changes occur. Initially, the food is just a big ball of kind of moistened, but mostly still intact food. By the end of its time in the stomach, it becomes a liquidy mass called chyme. You maybe have seen chyme if you've ever vomited. So here's how this works. First of all, in the stomach, there's mechanical digestion because the stomach is muscular and it will squeeze and churn the food to break it down into smaller pieces. However, if we zoom in on the wall of the stomach, there are some exciting things going on. The cells in the stomach make something called gastric juice. And gastric juice is made up of a few things. First of all, there's hydrochloric acid. This will destroy pathogens that are in your food, and it'll also break down the food mechanically a little bit more. There's also pepsin. Pepsin is an important enzyme, and it will chemically digest protein. So the chemical digestion of protein begins in your stomach. Finally, in gastric juice, there is mucus, and this is essential because the mucus will coat your stomach wall and prevent that hydrochloric acid from actually eating away at your own cells. So after a couple hours, the food is turned into chyme and it's ready to move into the small intestine. And this is the unsung hero of the digestive system because very important things happen here. First of all, chemical digestion of all nutrients happens because of the enzymes in the small intestine. So everything gets broken down into their monomers here. Once they're broken down into the monomers, something else important happens. There are these little finger-like projections called villi lining the wall of the small intestine. And if you were to zoom in on them, you would see that the villi, or singular villus, contains capillaries. So once the nutrients are broken down, the villus will absorb the nutrients into the capillaries. And at this point, the blood can then carry the nutrients to all the various cells of the body. So not only does the small intestine do digestion, it also does absorption. Now, to do those two big jobs, the small intestine needs a little bit of help from the accessory organs. So the intestine does have some of its own enzymes, but it gets help from the liver because the liver makes bile, which will break down fat. Now, once the liver makes bile, it actually sends it into the gallbladder to store the bile. And then if you eat a food that's really high in fat, like for example a hamburger, the gallbladder will release the bile into the small intestine to help break down that fat. The pancreas is also very important. It makes a bunch of different enzymes that it also secretes into the intestine to help break down food. So at this point, most of the food has been broken down and absorbed into the bloodstream. But not everything was broken down and absorbed. At the end of this process, you've got some waste material. And the large intestine is going to absorb water from that waste to produce feces, solid waste. Something else important happens in the large intestine. You've got some friendly bacteria living in there that will help make vitamins for you. Now, once enough feces have built up and are being stored in the rectum, they will be eliminated through the anus. And that is what happens to a hamburger when you eat it.